Well, good evening and welcome to this special episode of The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. It's a special episode because we're doing a roundtable tonight. We haven't done a roundtable in a while, and in the past, the reason that we did roundtables was to bring together former guests who had similar backgrounds, or maybe at some time completely different backgrounds, to compare their stories, but maybe more importantly, to compare how the Holy Spirit works in their life. Whenever I do a Journey Home program, I'm always thinking about you, the listeners, especially those of you who have family members or such that have left the faith. I'm thinking about how the witnesses of our guests hopefully are an encouragement to you. I end every program with that. Well, our two guests tonight, whose programs aired recently, were former atheists. Sister Theresa Aletheia Noble, and we're also joined by Leah Sargeant. So let me welcome you both. First of all, before I gab any farther, welcome back to the program. It's wonderful to have you both here. As I was saying to the audience, we've had your stories recently, but it's neat to be able to bring you here. I will tell the audience that because your stories were recently broadcast, they can go online and to ewtn.com or to chnetwork.org to see your recent program, to get the whole skinny. All right. But now that I've got you here, we want to talk about atheism. But just in case somebody's out there that didn't see those programs, what I'd like to do is first invite you both to give a little snippet. But I'm going to stop your journeys. What I'd like you to do, sister, first is to tell us your story before you came back to the church, before you describe where you were and how you understood life, if you would. And then I'll ask the same thing of you, Leah.
Well, I was raised Catholic. I was a cradle Catholic, but when I was 14, I decided that I didn't believe in God. It was kind of a combination of different things. It was my natural skepticism and doubts about the truth of the faith, the problem of suffering, and then combined with just bad examples of Christians that turned me off to the faith and made me think that maybe I could be a better person without this. So that was kind of where I was in the beginning and where I was kind of starting from.
And as you described in your story, this was not just a casual thing. You were into it 150%.
Yeah, I made the decision and I decided not to become confirmed, and that was the road that I was on for, over a dozen years.
And I guess another thing that I remember about your story was it wasn't that your family was nominal in their faith, anything but. They were very, very active in their faith, strong in catechetics. You weren't lacking in any of that.
No, and I wasn't lacking I knew the truths of the faith, and I had been raised in a very faithful environment, but it just didn't. In the end, with all of those different things that were pulling on me, I just didn't believe that it was true.
All right. So we'll pause there, sister. Leah.
I grew up in an atheist house in a relatively non-religious neighborhood, so I didn't know anyone personally who I knew as religious. But for me, that kind of wasn't a void waiting to be filled. I wanted to be a good person. I was deeply interested in philosophy. I didn't think religion had the answers, but I was into Stoicism and Immanuel Kant, and it was a very morally oriented atheist who cared a lot about knowing what was true and how to put it into action.
Okay. If you looked back in those times of your life in your atheist, people define and sometimes misuse the words atheist and agnostic. Maybe clarify to the audience the difference and help us understand, were you more an atheist and an agnostic, or is there a difference? And either of you on that issue.
I think for me, the decision was between choosing something or not choosing something. And to me, the better choice was to choose something, because how can you kind of guide your life by a lack of choice? So that's why I considered myself an atheist.
Yeah. Where an agnostic would have been, I just don't know. I'm
just not
there.
Sure. And how do you guide your life on that? So,
Yeah, I think an agnostic has an active problem that does need to be resolved one way or the other. And I wouldn't have described myself that way because I felt that, my level of non-belief in God was sufficient to just act on. In the same way that I haven't deeply investigated whether there's life on Mars, but I don't expect there is. I don't believe there is, and I don't build my life around that. And that was kind of the level of my atheism.
All right. I remember when you and I talked, you had felt that as a result of your choice, that you had arrived at a higher plane, if you will. Would you both have affirmed that that's where you understood yourselves in your atheism?
I'd say a more accurate portrait of the world is what I would have said, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's just like when you're at the optometrist and they're like better or worse. And I thought atheism is seeing the world more clearly.
Yeah, and same with me. I think we both kind of considered what we were doing as we were able to see things more objectively. Yeah.
But you called yourself an evangelist.
Oh, yeah, but not for atheism alone, right? Because simply, trying to persuade my religious friends to not be religious was not sufficient, right? I went to the Reason Rally in DC, which was a big atheist gathering, with a sign that said, like, I'm an atheist and a virtue ethicist. And then on the other side said, like, what's your fill in the blank? Because, atheism just doesn't by itself say what your philosophy is or what you believe. I had no interest in simply recruiting other people to atheism. I wanted to recruit them to a philosophical outlook that still ordered your life, which atheism doesn't by itself.
Did you feel the same way, you think, back then?
Yeah, I think the difference between Leah and me is that I didn't ascribe to a specific philosophical worldview. I kind of was constructing my own. But I did see it similarly. Atheism in itself can't guide you in making moral decisions. You have to find something to guide you in how to live life.
I remember, I know I've mentioned this on the program before, but in the movie Castaway, when the main character, Tom Hanks, is stranded on an island in the middle of nowhere. He's out there, I think, for 3 years. But at some point, one of the pilot's bodies floats up. And so he buries it. And he's got it there, and there's a moment when he kind of stands over the grave. And as you're watching the movie, you're wondering if he's going to say something, and he kind of goes and walks away. So I mean, to me, it was a visual sign of if you don't believe in anything, what do you do? When I get you to think back during your lives as atheists, was it just a void up there? Like if you had been in that situation, would it have just been a nothing? You know what I'm saying?
I think I certainly thought of funerals as being primarily for living people to kind of grieve together, to tell stories about the person, including ones maybe you didn't know until this moment. But I thought of it as, oriented all towards the living, and that when you're dead, you're dead. And a lot of what I heard as kind of pitches for the afterlife were unpersuasive and to me undesirable, right? There was some kid's book that was kind of, and in heaven you get everything you wanted. You want to be an actress and now you get to star in anything. I'm like, well, that just sounds cheap, right? Like either you've actually worked for this or you haven't. And I'm uninterested in these kind of saccharine portraits of the afterlife.
Yeah, for me, I just thought of death as the end, and I thought of any other explanation for that as just kind of wishful thinking, just people desiring something to be beyond that. So they're kind of constructing this false reality.
What's funny is that the first work of soteriology sort of that I did find compelling as an atheist was C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce.
Yeah.
And what was compelling about it wasn't even, it felt like some pitches for the afterlife were bribery, right? And not Lewis. Lewis is writing a whole book about people struggling to enter heaven because they're reluctant to relinquish their sins. And that made more sense to me. And as an atheist, that was the first description of an afterlife I read that I believed could be just.
So sermons on hell and brimstone didn't kind of move you?
Not at all.
The opposite, right? If someone's threatening me,
Yeah.
I'm going to hold more strongly to what I believe to be true. And if the reason to obey God is because he might punish you with hell, that's not a compelling reason any more than this mugger has a gun to your head. And I'm like, well, that hardly gives any moral authority to the mugger, right? God's authority doesn't come from the fact that he can send us to hell. It comes from something else first.
Yeah. And I'd say that was the most ineffective thing that anyone ever said to me was, you could go to hell. Really? I mean, first of all, I don't believe in hell, but second of all, that's how you're going to evangelize me by threatening me with eternal punishment.
Without any pitch for why it would be just, right? Like,
just kind of a threat. And what does that say about your view of God also, if that's how you kind of start out with someone is,
Well, in that sense, it's not just hell that you didn't believe in, but sin.
No, I mean, I believed in moral wrongdoing, right? Yeah. I wouldn't have always used the word sin to describe it, but G.K. Chesterton says original sin is the part you least have to make a pitch for. Everyone knows it's there. Everyone knows I do not what I want, but what I do not want, I do. Yep. So I would have said, there's just this gap between who we are and what the moral law is, and we struggle to approach it. And that's sin, right? I just wouldn't have used that language.
Yeah, I think I was similar. I think I had this almost Pelagian view of, an unrealistic view of how virtuous we can be without God, maybe. But that's how and I also think, I think our view of moral wrongdoing can be watered down when we don't realize that it's a sin, not only against others, but against God. So it did become a little bit watered down for me over time.
I was worried it was the Christians who were watering down, again, what I wouldn't have described as sin, but as, just like moral shortcomings. Yeah. Because to me, the idea of forgiving sin was weird. I really liked Inspector Javert from Les Miserables because he has this uncompromising moral standard. He doesn't meet it. He throws himself off a bridge. And it's not that I was, hoping for that to be the outcome, but I kind of shared with him the intuition that the moral law is almost more real than I am. And that if one of us has to go, it's me, right? And the idea that, God, almost the way I thought of forgiveness as ignores or overlooks our sin as a Christian pitch. I'm like, well, I'd rather just be condemned, right? I don't want someone to say that what I've done wrong isn't really wrong.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I do think we used to have an atheist family that lived across the street from us. And one thing my mother said to me one day, and this was after I was an atheist, she said, they really do focus on how to be good, almost more than we do. And I remember thinking about that and thinking, yeah, that's why I'm an atheist, because, and I think that can really work against Christians when we're not focused on living a virtuous life and how grace can allow us to live a virtuous life, especially when we're surrounded by atheists who really are concerned with that. Not everyone, but a lot of them are.
A mystery to so many Christians, when they just assume that, well, an atheist doesn't have any foundation for morality, so then therefore they shouldn't be moral. But yet, why are they so good? So I mean, how do you put those two together? Just to make sure I get this in, our guests are Sister Theresa Aletheia Noble and Leah Libreasco Sargeant. How did you as atheists understand conscience? Or did you recognize conscience?
Something I struggled a little to formalize into a system, right? Because from my point of view, conscience is like your eyes, right? It's a sense of some kind. Everyone receives sense perceptions of moral judgment before they're old enough to say sense perceptions of moral judgment, the same way we see before we articulate that we're seeing. So it almost felt like to me that I lived in a weird time, like before the study of optics, but before like the full understanding of conscience, where for long parts of human history, no one had dissected an eyeball. Yep. And people did not walk around saying, gosh, I don't understand exactly how I see things, so probably the whole physical world is illusion, right? Mm-hmm. And to me, the crazy thing was that people seem to take this approach towards conscience, where they're like, I've never dissected the conscience, I don't understand exactly how it works, so the parsimonious thing is to assume it's not real. And I'm like, that would have been a crazy thing for people to do about eyeballs before you'd taken one apart. And it seemed just as crazy to me that people were willing to make that leap about conscience, that the perception is just as strong, just as immediate. The mechanism, to me at that time, not being understood. You go, wow, I hope I figure some stuff out about the mechanism that I can kind of intuit must exist, not, well, if I haven't had it, with a scalpel, I should probably disregard the sensation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I imagine one of the issues is that people will assume that this voice from within that's telling me that which I'm doing is wrong. Well, that's just another one of those lingering ideas from that religious past of mine that I just need to squelch.
Mm-hmm.
But people don't think that day to day, right?
I don't know that, but that's a wondering.
I don't think. I think they think it on a couple edge cases where they really want to do the other thing, or where they have mixed feelings. But for the most part, people hear the promptings of their conscience and act, and don't go, "Oh, I'm a little frustrated. I might kick this person, but is that just a remnant of like? Oh yeah, no, I can't kick this person. For standing on the left side of the escalator."
Well, see, where I see it is when there's that wonderful. In fact, just recently it happened to me when I went and bought lunch, and the person, instead of giving me $6 back, gave me $56 back. Mm-hmm. So in that moment, I have a $50 that ain't mine. Mm-hmm. It's supposed to be a $5. What do I do in that moment? Mm-hmm. Now I could say, well, I'm feeling like I ought to give that back, but I could say, that idea to give, why? To me, I'm not sure they go through the analysis of it, but again, this issue of conscience. In fact, I'm wondering with what you atheists would have felt about St. Thomas More. Was he a fool for giving his life for conscience? Mm-mm. Would you have thought that then?
No, because that's what he believed was true. So I definitely believed in conscience, and I believed in following your conscience. But I think, unlike Leah, I did experience moments where what my materialist atheism told me was this was okay, but then I would do it and I would feel like it wasn't okay. And in those moments I would say it must be my Catholic guilt or these things in my background that are kind of making me feel guilty about something that's really not wrong. But in reality, those moments were actually very helpful in the sense that I felt this pull in two directions and really strongly. And I wondered, well, I don't know what to do here. What's happening? But because I did believe in conscience and I didn't know which pull to trust.
Yeah.
I think, as my praise of Javert suggests, even though they are different people, I was in favor of St. Thomas More. And part of what I found striking about it is I thought, and this helped me understand what martyrdom means in the church, especially the play treatment of his life, A Man for All Seasons, because part of what being a virtuous person isn't expanding your capacity to do anything, right? Which is how we talk about freedom, being free to choose anything. It's actively giving up the capacity to do things that are wrong. And that what I found compelling about More's life, especially as told by Bolt, is that More just kind of became the sort of person who could not blaspheme the church, right? And didn't seek martyrdom, but got to the point where it wasn't really a choice about whether to be martyred. If the king had said to them, Sir Thomas More, I need you as a sign of your loyalty to me to jump out of this third-story window and fly, he'd say, that's just not something I can do for you. I'm unable to do it. It's not even that I'm refusing, I'm unable. And that he loved God so much that he was unable as much as unwilling to blaspheme his church. And that's, I think part of what growing up is. It's not learning to do everything, it's learning to relinquish things.
Mm-hmm.
So you would have considered yourself a first generation atheist. Mm-hmm. You were kind of a second generation atheist because you said in your story that your dad actually was brought up Catholic but was non-practicing. Your mother was a non-practicing Jew.
We can't remember how far back you'd have to go on my mom's side to find someone who practiced. So
in some sense, you represent a person who comes from a very strong family. As far as your parents were concerned, they probably did everything they thought they needed to do to make sure they delivered the faith to you and didn't catch. Mm-hmm. Yours way back when. Okay. Why is there such an increase of nuns today in our culture? Even just recently, within a week or so, there was another Pew survey that demonstrated that both Protestantism and Catholicism are going down. Mm-hmm. They've reduced by 3% nationwide over the last 10 years, whereas the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, the non-faith atheist agnostics are increasing. Mm-hmm. What's going on? from your background, given where you were? Are a lot of them where you were they were given it and then just rejected it, or were never given it, do you think?
There were a lot more people in your bucket than in mine.
Yeah,
There may be more in the next generation who are like me, but
yeah.
I was at the cutting edge. But I think one problem is that, less so in your case, right? But for many folks, the Christianity they're rejecting was such a pallid example of it, or so little was given, that they're not wrong to say, this can't be true, this doesn't hold together. You think about going to Mass every week and hearing a priest kind of take the parables and take the Gospels as interesting moral lessons, and only that. And say something that either of us could have perhaps been in the room with and agreed with, without really discussing who Christ is, that he's active in our life. He didn't just give us a set of interesting conundrums to muddle over privately. You can walk away from that. That's not what Peter said he wasn't walking away from. That's not, where else will I go? You have the words of eternal life. And I saw someone say, just briefly enough to tweet, right, that if the church is a social gathering, there are other places that do that better. If the church is working for justice in the world, that's important. But there are other places where that's their primary mission, they do it better. The church has to be about Christ first and foremost, because that's the thing that no one else has.
We need to know that beneath everything in the church is Jesus. And if we don't know that, then everything eventually loses its meaning.
And to be honest, if you don't say that, then it's not Christ that people are turning their back on when they move towards atheism. It's this particular way of spending time together and talking about how to be good people.
What about first-generation atheists?
I think, in my case, it was an abrupt decision, but I think for a lot of people, it's a gradual decision. It's something that happens over time. And I think often what I've found is the seeds of doubt are planted very young, that faith is not compatible with science or math or or reason. And that's really a very un-Catholic way to think about it. But I think living in the United States with there's kind of a Protestant worldview in a lot of places, and so the incompatibility of that is drilled into kids' minds, especially by new atheists. You see it all over the internet. This is just incompatible. Faith has nothing to do with reason. I think that drives people away, because obviously that's not true.
Atheists, you can't generalize all atheists, but just like you can't generalize all Protestants, but a disbelief in the vertical, God, angels, all of that. I would assume, therefore, questionable about, as you use the word teleography, in other words, meaning, purpose, plan, direction, but also a denial of the reality of evil. The devil and his horde, almost to the point where I almost feel funny saying that, because we live in a culture that just thinks it's a joke to believe in devil. As you look back on your days of evil, was the devil actively involved in your lives?
Absolutely. I mean, he's still trying to get me. He's trying to get us all.
Right.
But I think that something that struck me a lot is, after I came into the church, I went through RCIA, and then the next year I was asked to be on the RCIA team and help with the catechesis. And one time before they did the rites, which are mini exorcisms, I was trying to explain to them about the devil, and I realized this hadn't really been talked about with them. And as I looked around the circle, none of them believed me. Like, they believed in God, but they were shocked that I was talking to them about the devil. And to me, that was pretty shocking. I think that is a problem, because when you lose the supernatural aspect of Catholicism, I mean, really, what else is there? And you lose the eschatology, you lose the context. If it becomes just about this life, then why not try atheism? Why not try virtue ethics? Why not try all these different things? Because if it's just about this life, then maybe another way is better.
Yeah.
I just think the reality of moral evil is pretty stark, and many atheists reply strongly to it, just as you did by becoming a vegan, right?
Yeah.
That, it's the devil as an active agent of evil rather than just evil as something people are doing themselves that kind of takes an additional pitch or argument. But Solzhenitsyn says, like, the line between good and evil runs through the heart, through every human heart. And everyone knows that, right? Everyone knows that both by looking at history and by looking at their own lives and the things they're not proud of or the things that they haven't done, but there's like that little bit of tugging that you might, right? And even the fear that you might, right? A lot of the things we do that are evil, we're not excited as we're about to do them, right? And so I think one of the transitions is more that there is someone backstopping us when we resist temptation. It's not just something we're doing on our own, as both of us thought as atheists. And honestly, it's a little bit of a comfort to now pray the St. Michael's prayer in moments of temptation or in response to evil, and really to rebuke Satan rather than just, see it as a choice I'm making by myself with no one on either side.
Right.
Yeah, I'm older than both of you, but I remember cartoons when I grew up that would draw this little figures with the devil and the angel, whispering in the ear. And what that is subtly doing is, in the child's mind, this is a joke. This isn't real. This is just cartoons. And the battle, as St. Francis de Sales talks about, that's a very real. And if you're oblivious to both, then you're oblivious to whether those voices that temptations are temptations or not.
Medium on whether it makes it a joke, because I find it a little helpful. Maybe it's a childish spirit in me. But, sometimes there are moments that are kind of clearly not of God, in my life that I have more trouble recognizing in myself, right? Especially when I was first converting, the sense of, well, you're really too bad at praying to pray. You should hold off on prayer till you're better at prayer. That's not from God, right? And I had a friend who was saying the same thing, who was also, in her case, coming into the Eastern Orthodox Church. And what sounded reasonable in my head was clearly crazy when she said it. And then I would pray for her, and I would think about like hitting that shoulder devil with a 2x4 where he wasn't expecting it, because it was her problem, not mine. But both of us had trouble praying for ourselves in those moments of temptation, but we decided we'd just pray for each other. And whenever Satan was bothering one of us, it would be a prompt to save the other, and we'd get him where he wasn't expecting it.
Well, I know I've mentioned this on the program, but Paul Harvey, the great radio announcer, once gave a talk on what I would do if I were the devil. And his first thing was, I'd convince the world I don't exist. And that's it. And that's it. And we're going to take a break, and we'll come back. And I want to ask you whether the psalmist was true when he said that a fool says in his heart, there is no God. All right, so we'll come back just a moment. See you later. Welcome back to this special edition of the Journey Home, our Atheist Roundtable. And I'm Marcus Grodi, your host, and our guest, our sister Theresa Aletheia Noble and Leah Libreasco Sargeant. And before we jump back into the story, I wanted to take a moment, first of all, to remind you of a book published by EWTN. 9 converts explain their journey home from atheism to Catholicism. This is a collection of, I think there were 8 or 9, I just said that, didn't I? 9 former Journey Home guests. And EWTN took their stories and put it in this fine collection. Second of all, again, I want to remind you to go to chnetwork.org. That's my website, the work of the Coming Home Network. We have lots of conversion stories there. And especially if you're somebody on the journey, you want to be connected with others on the journey. That's why we connect you with our website, chnetwork.org. Boy, I'm anxious to move your stories on, but before I get there, I want to ask you a couple other questions. From an atheist perspective, how did you understand beauty? Now that's, to some people, say, well, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Well, is that all that it is? there's no depth to it. It's just really whatever, and just in this world that looks beautiful to you, look beautiful. Or could you see that there was something much more eternal to the reality of essence of beauty?
I think part of what I understood to be at the heart of beauty was order and resolution, right? That, I'm not a music theory person, but there are times, and I'm particularly into Broadway musicals where, the Tonight Quintet from West Side Story, you get to a chord, there's something really good about the chord. And if I were a music theory person, I'd say, oh, it's resolving to the tonic. Like, I don't actually understand what it's doing, to be honest. But they're right, that there's an orderedness to the whole song that kind of creates a yearning, delays the yearning. If it's Sondheim, like, teases you that the yearning will be resolved, does not resolve it, and then eventually resolves it. And a lot of beauty is, I think, that sense of things suddenly fitting together, falling into place, and being in right relation with each other.
I was going to say, for you, for a scientific standpoint, that's how you determine whether it's a good theory or not, is the beauty of it.
It's always an active argument in science whether you're allowed to use that as the criterion. Right. Because mathematicians have the problem now where there are some computer-generated proofs that are true. We're like, well, there must be a different proof besides this one because this one is ugly, right? And everything true, and a lot of mathematicians believe this, must be provably true in a beautiful way, not just true in a kludgy, messy way.
Yeah, that old cartoon of the scientists on the big board with calculations everywhere, and then right here it says God. Well, that's not, from their perspective, that's not beautiful. That's not ordered. That doesn't, wait. From your perspective, did you deal with the issue of beauty?
I think similar to Leah, I believed in underlying rationality that in morality and science and mathematics and art, and I thought that was beautiful, but I didn't think that necessarily meant that God existed.
Right.
So I think I didn't make that connection, but I think my conversion made that connection for me, where it was really a moment of grace where I realized that I'm surrounded by beauty, and there is an exemplar of beauty. There is someone who is beauty itself and truth itself.
The Christian church hadn't been around more than a decade or so, and Paul wrote his letter to the Galatians a couple decades or so, and he says that he's amazed that people are already following false gospels. And that and other verses always tended to tell me that every one of us created in God's image has been created to follow the gospel. But if we don't know the right one, we'll follow wrong ones. And sometimes we think we're doing the best thing that ever happened because we're off after another gospel. I was thinking about your own journey, in essence, into veganism from your perspective. Was a bit of a false gospel?
Yeah, well, I don't know if I would say that, but I do relate a lot to Paul, who was kind of, he was the best of the Pharisees and followed the law to the letter. And veganism kind of became something like that for me. It became my moral path, and I was such a perfectionist about it that I would be looking at ingredients. I didn't eat honey. Didn't wear leather. There were so many. It was and it almost made me feel morally superior to others. So I think, but God worked in that, like I was really trying to be good, and I think in the midst of that, I realized how much I was failing. Even though I was capable of this life of pretty stark discipline, I really was still a terrible person, and I really needed a lot of help. And so I think God helped me to see that.
But it was touching that void inside of you and it gave you meaning and purpose and goal. Did you have anything like that in your journey
I mean, I simply wanted to be a good person. I thought that was a Stoic Kantian, right? I think in many cases that when people are seeking to live rightly and are wrong, in good faith about what that means, you don't get them closer to God by saying, care less about doing the right thing, right? You say, you know what, like there's a bigger good you're ignoring, and you should be applying your considerable loves and talents to that, right? Or, this is kind of a wrongly considered good, but you kind of never want to take away the motive force that's driving someone to try and live rightly. You want to say that motive force needs to be directed elsewhere.
Yeah, well, veganism, based on honoring the life of non-human creatures
Mm-hmm.
is a good thing. I mean, I'm going to say
Yeah.
something. I'm sure some people think I'm stupid to even say, but do we know that over 100,000 animals are killed every year on our highways?
I did not.
You know, we know that, and we don't even think about it, oblivious, because hey, having a car and doing that and having that life, that's
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
well, you know, there needs to be a balance of respectability for the creation God's given us to find a balance to that. Okay, let's try and move forward. The psalmist, which is interesting because one of the two psalms that are almost repeated, is one of the few psalms that are repeated, Psalm 14 and Psalm 53 are almost identical. Both of them begins with the idea, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, doing abominable iniquity. There is none that does good. Did you think it was foolish? Would you look back? You know, I mean, was the psalmist right, or how do we understand what the psalmist says on that? The fool says in his heart, there is no God.
You know, almost immediately after my conversion, I did, when God was giving me the grace to have a sense of the depth of my sin, I did kind of beat my chest and say, well, I was such a fool, such a sinner. But I think after this many years of just really getting to know God, I'm able to see myself as God. I think saw me, and I think he had so much compassion for me. I think he just really loved me and wanted to guide me to the truth, but I think he did it slowly. I fought against it. I ran away. But it was all. I just feel when I think of myself, I think I'm able to see myself with so much compassion because I think he saw me that way, and that's what made me love him so much.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I started completely outside the church, right? So I didn't start by rejecting a God I had known in any way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to take the Catholic Church piecemeal, and in some ways that itself is somewhat bonkers, right? So it's a big shift to make, and it took time for me to be persuaded to make it and to make it. And I could have, I'll say just, I guess my defense is I could have done much more foolish things, you know, which include saying, I don't understand what conscience is, so I have to deny it, right? And I don't know, I feel like that's part of what the psalm is getting, like, what will you throw out when you don't have God? And I hope I held on to as many true things as I could manage in the meantime.
I'm assuming the context of the psalmist is the people of God, Israel, where everyone believes, and then if you foolishly deny everything. But I honestly, in what I was talking about earlier with when I said false, in quotes, gospel, is that people are yearning. That God does put within us a seed to come home. And we look for other things. And that's why I was thinking of a scripture to mention where it says in 1 Timothy 2, first of all, then I urge that supplication, prayers, intercession, thanksgivings be made for all men, everyone, for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a quiet, peaceable life, godly and respectable and everywhere, that promotes an environment that allows us to reach. And then he goes on, this is good and it is acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth, everyone. That's what we want. So it's not about pointing out the foolishness of people, but maybe from our perspective, we realize that, you know, they bought into things. How do we reach them? So maybe at this point, let's remind the audience of what was it that broke through your barriers that brought you home to our Lord Jesus Christ in his church. I'll start with you.
Well, I think a big part of it was kind of pursuing that question of what is morally right and how do we come to have knowledge of it? And that the further I was going down there, I got kind of jostled off of my Kantianism and into virtue ethics, which has a very different kind of sense of what morality is. Whereas, you know, I had thought about morality as a big rule book, and I had to figure out what the rules are and how you derive them. Virtue ethics really has this teleological view that there's something that's fitting to me as a human being, I have to understand what that is, what the ideal human is, which means I was already, in some ways, asking to know Christ without framing it that way, right? But God's very generous in kind of the non-prayer he answered, right? If I just say, I want to know what it means to be a good person and what like the fullest expression of that is, I am asking to know Christ, if not in those words. And God kind of took every inch I gave, right, and made the most of it.
It was, I get the stories mixed up in my mind. It was you that said you realized that morality loved
That's
me.
me.
Morality loved me. And really, audience, reflect on that when a person comes to that realization by grace that morality loves me. In other words, it's more than just a bunch of rules. Yeah. It's a person.
Which was more than I would have asked for. I was happy with a bunch of rules, right? That felt like gift enough. And God so often gives us more than we ask for. Mm-hmm. If we open the door a little, it's not just that he gives what we desire. He has more than what we desire because we don't know how to desire what he longs to give us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you were saying that once that thing hit, then all of a sudden everything kind of fit into place.
Yeah.
All right, you, Sister Theresa.
I think for me, you know, my involvement in animal rights activism helped me to realize that my materialism just wasn't giving me enough explanations for the world, and I started to realize that I believed in the soul and in the immortal soul, but I was trying to I was really struggling intellectually to figure out what that meant, and I think that's when God broke in and helped me to see that he existed, and that he loved me and that he had a plan for my life. And so that completely changed the trajectory of my life at that point.
Had you been baptized?
No.
Okay, so you weren't baptized.
I got all 3 sacraments in one day.
The reason I wanted that, because sometimes I've heard many converts, reverts, go look back and realize that the baptismal graces had always been there.
Yeah.
I mean, as you look back, do you see the advantage of that for yourself?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's something that concerns me because I think this, as people fall away from the church and raise children, they're not going to be doing baptisms even out of any cultural, you know, and that's concerning because baptism is what makes us Christians. It's a powerful sacrament, and it's something that it imprints itself on our souls. So it's not something that you can get rid of, even if you reject the faith. And it's almost like a scar that throbs. Yeah.
Well, you contrast that with the atheist groups that were doing the debaptisms, where they just point a hairdryer at your head, right?
Yeah.
And it really, it implies it's just about membership or even, our choice and something we can renounce. And baptism, priesthood, they're all indelible marks on the soul. And confirmation too, right? And can't be given up. Even when we're unfaithful, he is faithful.
Yeah.
If you look back on it, then that's one of the most debilitating things that happened in the Reformation, if you will, was undercutting the belief that baptism makes any difference.
Yeah.
And now we have fewer and fewer people that are receiving those baptismal graces. And the way it's belittled is they're trying to make us think, well, you think it's magic, right? You baptize a person, then they're saved. No, but it's part of the sacramental economy of the church. In fact, maybe ask you both that, because moving from atheism into accepting not just Jesus, but the sacramental economy is a huge jump.
Yeah.
Either of you?
I think one thing that's really striking about it is, it removes or lessens the temptation to anxiety that I do hear a lot more in friends who are Christians outside the church, with this sense of, okay, I prayed and I was sorry, but was I sorry enough? I accepted Jesus into my heart, but then I did something bad, so I should ask him again, right? Because maybe I didn't ask hard enough the first time, right? And that's a real worry, right? And we know we fall down on our part of prayer. That's a given. And to kind of have your relationship with Christ have so much uncertainty and depend so much on your own heart is very hard. Oh. And instead in the church to say, God is active all over the world. The sacraments don't limit his scope of action, but they give us a reassurance that we can come home to the Eucharist, we can come home to confession, and God is always present there, is always faithful. And, if we are repentant, if we receive him, without mortal sin, he does for us what he promised. And he's active everywhere else. And it's in no way a reason to stop asking for more of him everywhere else. But it's a huge comfort to me, even when I'm just in kind of ecumenical Christian groups, to say, let's pray the Lord's Prayer together, because it's the prayer we know he gave us and that we're all sure as Christians is pleasing to him. And I think of the sacraments as kind of the same way. These are the ways of asking for his grace that he has guaranteed to us. And we should ask all the time, but we don't have to be frightened when we do these.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, I think it's kind of funny because I converted, and then there was a several year period before I entered the convent, but I still was entering the convent as fairly new to things. I didn't know the Angelus when I entered the convent, and I didn't know words to songs, and my co-novices would make fun of me, and I'd be like, "Don't you remember I was an atheist for a really long time? Like I missed out on a lot of things." But part of the benefit to that is it's really during one of my retreats, I came out of my retreat just telling everyone, like, we're baptized. Like, this is so exciting. Like, the Trinity dwells within us. Like, we're infused with the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. Like, this is amazing. And, even I would tell cradle Catholics this, and they'd kind of look at me like, I'm really not feeling the excitement. And so I think it's beautiful because I can communicate the beauty of it, because it's so beautiful and it's so powerful. Baptism is what helps us become saints. Like, we wanted to be good people. We wanted to be moral. That's really hard to do on your own. With baptism, that makes a lot more possible. And I've experienced that on a real level, that I'm capable of much more goodness when I have the help of the grace of baptism and sacraments.
I think it is always kind of startling how routine these extraordinary graces are, that, there's a church somewhere near you, in most places, offering daily mass, and Christ is right there on the altar, right? You hear people say, like, well, what will you do in the second coming? Or would we recognize Christ if he came back? It's like, he's right there, And there was one, I think it's Tertullian of the Church Fathers, who was giving a homily on people delaying baptism. And he's like, if I said for one day I was giving out gold here at the church, you people would trample each other to get up for where it was being handed out. And instead, I'm only offering you the remission of original sin and a permanent salvic mark, and you are dawdling at the door. And I'm barely paraphrasing him, right? I think even within the church, that, there are moments I'm bored in Mass, or, thinking about what I'll do afterwards. And I'm really forgetting the reality of what we profess.
Yeah, we start to take it for granted. I remember I would drive to adoration, and I would get this feeling like, I better hurry up because there might be a ton of people there. And every time I got there, I'd be like, oh, actually, there's not a lot of people. But it was like I felt like I was going to a rock concert to see a rock star, and everyone's going to want to go and if they did understand, they would. Like, it would be packed. That's Jesus.
Well, it's interesting, you're both touching on something, how do I put it in the words, that when you move from atheism into a vibrant faith in Christ and his church, there is a movement towards urgency, a seriousness. And talk about, if you would, the important element of that in our faith, the urgency today. Today, remember Joshua in the Old Testament, today, follow. Who are you going to follow? What about the importance of urgency in our faith?
Yeah, it sounds a little bit like that was part of our lives beforehand also, because I saw your program and I heard how much of a 150% person you were about things that weren't God also.
Right.
But I think one of the things that really touched me a bit when I was still an atheist and I was going to Mass, because I had a Catholic boyfriend, we made a deal about exchanging Mass for ballroom dance classes. And there was just one of the hymns that was a modern hymn, right? But it was, the will you let the blinded see if I but call your name? And I did think, gosh, if I'm wrong about this, like, I'm saying no to healing the blind and like letting people free and striking off their chains. And I think I'm right? But it kind of brought home that sense of urgency and the stakes of, wow, if there is a God and he really wants to work through me and I'm saying no, that is pretty serious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think for me, the urgency is on a personal level and on a evangelizing others level. But on a personal level, I think connecting with the Stoics, you know, the Stoics would always remind themselves that we could die tomorrow.
Yeah.
So we need to live well now. And so that's, I've been, that's been helpful to me in living urgency in my personal life. But I also think knowing Christ and knowing the despair that I felt, trying to figure out the truth on my own and trying to just use the power of my own intellect and finding the truth in a person who is Jesus Christ, who is the way and the truth and the life, that gives me so much urgency because it gave me so much joy, and I want to share that with others.
Maybe one little question here. What were some arguments that religious people used on you that fell flat? In other words, if we're going to try and help atheists, what are some arguments that just fall flat?
I got pitched on praying, you know, and someone's like, it'd be okay. Like, you could just try praying and you can tell God why you're angry at him. And I'm like, I'm not angry at God, you know, and some people are, but it's a big mistake to assume that's everyone's relationship, especially when what I felt is I had no relationship. There was no one on the other side. There was no grudge I held any more than, you know, the like secret rabbit that lives in the moon, right? Like, and so that was just, it was kind of a guess, and then it shows that you're not really listening to someone's particular form of atheism. I think we both mentioned kind of the Hell House pitches, right? Be Christian or else something really bad will happen to you. And if you have a moral atheist, of course they're going to say no to that, right? Never give way to terrorism.
Yeah.
But
I think when people, the hell thing was really ineffective. When people would make assumptions about where it was coming from, when they would kind of have a disdain for atheism as if I hadn't thought about it. And I was like, I think about this all the time. How can you possibly think this is just coming from a place of rebellion or something? Yeah, I think those are the main things.
You just want to be an atheist because you want to get away with doing things you know are bad, right? Which was neither of our approach. We were both extremists in our own way, right?
Yeah.
And I think people do sometimes say, I hope this isn't true because I don't want to live according to this rule. There's sometimes it's because they think the rule itself is immoral and they're confused about why God would ask them to do it. But yeah, it was just definitely not oh, you're really having a lot of fun, you'll give up. I'm like, I'm walking around thinking about, you know, what's the most extreme good I can do, no matter how I suffer for it. Like, I don't know what you guys think I'm doing with my Saturday nights, but...
Yeah.
Well, we have 2 minutes left. And I'd like to ask something based on your story, but in terms of reaching out to atheists, people that are agnostics or just not sure, how do you feel the effectiveness of the attitude of gratitude is? In other words, from our perspective, expressing the gratitude in life for our Creator as a means of reaching out. I know it seemed to be effective in your journey.
Yeah, I mean, gratitude, a moment of gratitude was really when I had my conversion. But I think in terms of reaching out to people, I really, really, truly believe that us living our baptismal call to the fullest is what is going to attract people to the church. I think partly because I had a bad experience with hypocritical Christians that kind of pushed me away from the church, but I also just think that is our call as Christians, is to live it to the fullest in a radical way, like radically, really to become saints. That's what's going to attract people more than any good arguments, or all of those things are very important. We have to have answers to people's questions and doubts, but I think the most powerful answer is saints. And I think that's what converted me, was seeing the gratitude and the humility and the peace and the joy that Christians lived. And they were grounded. There was something really rooted in them that was attractive to me.
I think, you know, the big mistake people make is thinking, you know, when I'm evangelizing an atheist, I've picked an atheist off the atheism production line and they're all the same, right? And that I think part of the challenge for Christians is, where is God already working in this individual person's life? Look at them as an individual who God loves specifically as themselves. Pray in gratitude to yourself for that, and then see where you can assist. Because God was calling me very powerfully. It's just I heard those calls as, math is orderly and beautiful. Dedicate yourself to being a good person. I didn't understand the source of them or what they were ultimately leading me to. But, Christians had the best chance of spotting what those were all pointing to around me and in kind of encouraging me to say yes, even when I didn't quite understand what I was saying yes to.
Yeah.
Thank you both for rejoining us on the journey home. And I'm going to encourage the audience to go to yours is the Daughter of St. Paul website, right? As they find out
Or
the work you do.
pursuedbytruth.com.
Pursuedbytruth.com.
Yeah.
Did you have a website?
Libreasco.com.
There we go. And so if the audience want to find out more about their work, you can go to those websites. You can go to chnetwork.org also, where you can hear their stories. Go EWTN.com, of course. You can hear the other Journey Home programs. But especially if you come to chnetwork.org, you can get connected with others on the journey, especially those that are being drawn from atheism to the church. So God bless. See you again next week.